So we left our previous discussion engaging with the question, why did Europe and not some other part of the old world end up discovering, quote unquote, the new world? Why not the Chinese? Why not India? Certainly they had the technology, especially in terms of China, and certainly had the wealth. Well, for one thing, historians note that exploration here in this context was driven by economics, by the entrepreneurial ambitions of these explorers and those who were subsidizing their voyages. You probably heard that Columbus was subsidized by the Spanish crown. It was their thirst for wealth and trade for exotic spices that weren't found in Europe. Certainly sugar, very addictive commodity. Like people today, many of us are addicted to sweetness. And certainly back then it was the case. Sugar could only be grown in certain parts of the world, tropical areas, certainly not Europe. So they had to go outside of the boundaries of the European continent to acquire those commodities. Textiles found in, for example, the region of India, not to mention precious metals like gold and silver. These were all sought abroad by these European explorers. Now, also important in this regard is economic competition wedded to imperial rivalry or imperial competition. You had these different European empires in competition with each other. And by the way, eventually, during the age of European imperialism, as it would be called by more contemporary historians, that is to say, during the 17th, 18th century, even the 19th century, one's imperial greatness would be measured by the extent of overseas colonies. All right, so the more colonies you had, the greater you were as an empire, vis-a-vis your competition, other European empires. So imperial greatness became measured by the amount of overseas territory, and that's going to be a spur for the acquisition of colonies. Also, as technology, Europeans made vast strides in seafaring technologies. They had improved their compasses. They had something called the quadrant and the astrolabe, which made their location in the middle of the ocean easier, right, to gauge. Certainly their ships, the caravel, was an improvement on earlier ships, and it could travel faster and go longer distances. These were all factors in traversing the Atlantic, right, that long distance. So the culmination of it were the initial voyages made by Columbus in 1492 and all the subsequent voyages after that. Now, what's going to happen, interestingly enough, is I just mentioned that Europe, being this relatively small corner of the entire world, by the next centuries, Europe is going to colonize not only the New World, that is both Americas, both continents, but it will take further steps to dominate, colonize other parts of the world, namely Africa and Asia. Okay, again, I call this the age of European colonialism or age of European imperialism. The culmination of this, by the way, you could see this in the year 1900. The entire world, or I should say almost the entire world, certainly over 90% of the entire world would be in control of some European empire, whether through direct colonial control or at the very least, like in the case of China during the 1800s, controlled, or their economy controlled by some economic, external power, namely European empires, the English Empire, the German Empire back then, the French, and eventually the American Empire in the early 1900s. So it's amazing to think about this, because it went from being, again, less wealthy and less powerful in 1490, for example, to being the most powerful and most dominant region of the world by the 20th century. This is called by older historians, as noted on the slide here, the European miracle. Okay, and it brings us to a very important category that we're going to constantly harken back to in this class, and this is the notion of exceptionalism. Right now, as noted again in the slide, exceptionalism refers to the notion or the belief that a particular group, whether it's a nation or an empire, a people, right, a culture, a religion, certainly a racial group, a belief that they are innately superior, right? They are exceptional. They're elevated above others. So in other words, if you're arguing for something, let's say American exceptionalism, and you may have heard that term bandied around here or there, this refers to the fact that, or the belief that that America is somehow exceptional or superior, not just unique. Okay, exceptionalism doesn't mean unique, because when you think about it, everyone's unique in some regard. Every nation, every people is unique in some regard. But what you're actually arguing is that, again, you're actually elevated above other people, whether it's culture, religion. Yeah, your religion is superior, you believe. Your political system, oh, this system is better than others, right? Even a sense of morality, right? Now, just to apply to Europe and the so-called European miracle, this idea that Europe, within these centuries following 1492, went from being, again, relatively behind to gain ascendancy to the top of the entire world. How did this happen? Right? Well, some believe that it is explained by something inherent to European civilization, their culture, knowledge, certainly religion. You know, the spread of Christianity, for example, was an explanatory factor in the European miracle thesis. And basically the argument is that it is inevitable, right? Because of this inherent superiority or exceptionalism, it's going to be inevitably the case that Europe would dominate the entire world. Now, these are older historians who came up with this thesis. When I say this, I'm talking about perhaps the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Right? So it's an older way of thinking about this event that I'm talking about. Actually, when you think about histories, it spans back to, you know, the invention of histories in Europe. During the early modern period, you can imagine, for example, the Spanish king saying, well, I'm such a great monarch. I have all these colonies across the world. I want someone to write down the great deeds accomplished during my reign as a king, or perhaps queen, right? Same thing with other monarchs in Europe. So this is really, in the European sense, the beginning of national histories, right? That we know today, you know, forming within these various dynasties in England and so forth. So when they ponder the question, that is to say, you know, historians, intellectuals, they ponder the question, what is it about Europe that led us to dominating the entire world? They came up with the idea of European exceptionalism. Again, that is, that there's something superior about Europe. We're talking about superior culture, superior technology, religion. Now, how true is this? Well, there's a lot of debate spent on this question, right? A lot of ink has been spilled by writers and scholars. But for the most part, sure, there were important technological feats that enabled Europe to accomplish this great fact. They were indeed superior in certain aspects, like, let's say, improving aspects of their technology, and certainly capitalism, right? One could argue at that time was superior to other parts in terms of acquiring wealth, just the goal of acquiring wealth, you know, just in that regard. But what contemporary historians, that is to, you know, more current historians, question is the idea that Europeans were somehow ordained by history, or even by God, God's chosen people, so to speak, to conquer the rest of the world, which, again, just to repeat, it would culminate by the year 1900 with over 90% of the world controlled by some European empire. So let's get a little philosophical here. If I ask you to consider this idea of different types of truth, what we're doing here is questioning the European exceptionalism thesis. All right? Let's consider this. Again, it is indeed true. I just mentioned this. It's undeniable fact, unassailable fact that Europe dominated the world by the turn of the 20th century. You can't question that. Yet, is the reason for this due to the inherent superiority of European empires? That is to say, is it due to European exceptionalism? Okay, so here I invite you to consider two types of truths. Okay, now again, let me emphasize, they're both true. Both types of truths are indeed true. They're not false. Okay, but nonetheless, you could set up this distinction in different types of truths. A necessary truth, to define that, is something that is true and cannot be false. Okay? Again, something that is true in every possible circumstance, and it cannot be false, it cannot be otherwise. Now, compare that with a contingent truth. Again, it is true, but it could have been false under different circumstances. For example, consider this truth right now. All triangles have three sides. Think about that. All triangles have three sides. Is this a contingent truth or a necessary truth? Well, if you answered necessary truth, you are correct. Okay, there's no way a triangle could have two sides, one side, four sides, a million sides, right? It necessarily, to use that term, must have three sides. Now, what if I pose this question? Columbus made contact with the New World in 1492. Right? Well, it is indeed true, but it could have been false, right? It could have been otherwise. In fact, the Chinese could have easily discovered it early in 1400 during the Ming fleet, or using the Ming fleet, right? So it's a contingent truth, right? It could have happened otherwise. So apply this to the European exceptional thesis. Europeans indeed dominated the world due to their superiority at one point. Is this contingent or necessary? Well, today we acknowledge it as contingent. But here's an important thing to notice in this issue. Whenever you couch your language in terms of inherent superiority or exceptionalism, right, you're saying that it cannot be otherwise. You're saying it's a necessary truth. It's inherently true. So exceptionalism, again, you're arguing that it had to happen no matter what because, you're just simply exceptional, or your race, your religion, your nation is just simply exceptionalism. It's inherently true. It could not be otherwise. Right? So again, to state it again otherwise, exceptionalism assumes necessary truth, not contingent truth. Okay, so let's say you argue that, let's say back in the day, England and its writers of history wrote that it became the most powerful empire, which is true, by the 1800s. They began to write that they were ordained by God, that they were God's chosen people, the Anglo-Saxons, that they were inherently superior as a race, God's chosen people. And you think about it, God does not deal with contingency, right? It has to be the case. It could not be otherwise. So, again, this is how past historians have framed this discussion for exceptionalism. But today, we note that, history is really an arena of contingent events, not necessary events.